Spain's monarchy once seemed untouchable. For decades, King Juan Carlos I was celebrated as the man who helped guide Spain into democracy after the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. But in the modern age, prestige can disappear faster than kingdoms fall. Financial scandals, political division, public outrage. A royal family suddenly facing the deepest crisis of its modern history. And as the institution around him began to crack, one man stood quietly in the background. For years, Felipe de Bourbon had been trained for the crown, not simply to inherit it, but perhaps one day to save it. Then came 2014, the abdication of a king, the rise of a new monarch. In the years that followed, Spain would face political division, institutional distrust, and growing debate over the role of the crown itself. And at the center of it all stood a king unlike his father, more reserved, more disciplined, more cautious. A monarch shaped not by conquest or charisma, but by duty. Can a monarchy survive the modern age? For Spain's crown, the answer may depend on one man. Long before he became King Felipe VI, there was already a plan. Because unlike many monarchs in history, Felipe was not raised to conquer a throne. He was raised to preserve one. When Felipe de Bourbon was born in January 1968, Spain was still living under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. The monarchy had not yet returned, and the future of the Spanish crown remained uncertain. But even as a child, Felipe was growing up inside a carefully constructed project, one designed to prepare the monarchy for a new era. His father, King Juan Carlos I, would eventually become one of the most important figures in modern Spanish history. Following the death of Francisco Franco in 1975, Juan Carlos led Spain through its transition to democracy, helping transform the country after decades of dictatorship. For many Spaniards, the monarchy became closely tied to stability itself. And for the young prince growing up inside the royal household, that lesson would shape everything. Unlike previous heirs in Spanish history, Felipe was not raised during war, exile, or political collapse. He was raised during the reconstruction of a modern constitutional monarchy. From an early age, his education was carefully planned. Like many future European monarchs, Felipe underwent military training in all three branches of the Spanish armed forces: the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. But preparation for the crown extended far beyond military discipline. He later studied law before completing a master's degree in foreign service at Georgetown University in the United States. The message was clear. Spain's future king would need to understand not only his country, but the rapidly changing world around it. Reserved, disciplined, and methodical, Felipe slowly developed an image very different from that of his father. Where Juan Carlos relied on charisma and political instinct, Felipe projected preparation, caution, and institutional duty. And nowhere was this new image more visible than during one of the defining moments of modern Spain. The 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona. For Spain, the Olympics were more than a sporting event. They were an international declaration. A country once isolated under dictatorship was now presenting itself as modern, democratic, and fully integrated into Europe. At just 24 years old, Prince Felipe carried the Spanish flag into the Olympic Stadium as a member of the national sailing team. The moment became symbolic. A prince perfectly aligned with the optimistic image Spain wanted to project to the world. At the time, few could have imagined that the monarchy standing proudly at the center of that optimism would one day face a crisis threatening its very survival. But before that crisis arrived, Felipe would spend decades preparing for a role he could never fully rehearse. As Prince of Asturias, he represented the future of the Spanish crown. But as long as King Juan Carlos remained one of the most respected figures in the country, Felipe's role was largely one of preparation. Year after year, the prince carried out an endless schedule of official duties, slowly building the image of a disciplined and dependable heir. Unlike the larger-than-life presence of his father, Felipe developed a quieter public identity. He rarely generated controversy, but he also rarely revealed much of himself. In many ways, he appeared less like a traditional monarch and more like a modern head of state in training. At the time, Spain itself seemed to embody optimism. The economy was expanding. The country was becoming increasingly globalized. And the monarchy still enjoyed broad public support. But the institution also understood something else. The future would demand adaptation. And in 2003, Felipe made a decision that would symbolize exactly that. He announced his engagement to Letizia Ortiz Roca Solano, a television journalist, a woman from a middle-class background, and a divorcee. For some, the relationship represented a modern monarchy finally connecting with contemporary Spain. For others, it challenged centuries of royal tradition. Their wedding in 2004 became one of the most watched royal events in modern Spanish history. A modern royal love story unfolding at the heart of Madrid. She was not an aristocrat. She had built her own career, her own public identity, long before entering the royal family. And perhaps that was precisely what made the moment resonate with so many Spaniards.
It was not common for a journalist to be where Letizia is today, right? I mean, for her to be queen consort, she was key to offering an image of the monarchy that was much closer. I mean, very, very, very close and very near to the people. I mean, I think she has played a crucial role.
Despite heavy rain covering the capital that day, thousands gathered outside the royal palace and Almudena Cathedral to witness what many viewed as the beginning of a new era for the crown. For supporters of the monarchy, Felipe and Letizia represented a different kind of royal couple, closer to contemporary Spain, more modern and more connected to the society they would one day represent. The birth of their daughters, Princess Leonor and Infanta Sofia, further strengthened the image of a new royal generation, a monarchy evolving alongside Spanish society. Beyond the official image of the crown, Felipe's role as a father became an important part of the monarchy's next chapter. As Leonor and Sofia grew up, he was often seen guiding them through the rituals of public life, standing beside them during ceremonies, explaining gestures of protocol, watching carefully as they began to speak, greet, and represent the institution on their own. For Princess Leonor, this guidance carried particular weight. Felipe understood better than anyone what it meant to grow up under the shadow of a future crown. He had lived that same preparation himself. At key moments in Leonor's public life, Felipe's presence was constant, not overwhelming, but steady. A father watching his daughter take the same path he once walked. And with Infanta Sofia, he also helped preserve the sense of a family unity around Leonor's future role. A reminder that behind the protocol, the uniforms and the ceremonies, the monarchy's future is also being shaped within a family. While Felipe continued fulfilling his constitutional duties, his public role gradually expanded. Not through dramatic speeches or political interventions, but through consistency. By the late 2000s, many inside and outside Spain already viewed him as a stabilizing figure for the institution's future, and seemingly untouched by scandal. But beyond the palace walls, Spain was beginning to change. The global financial crisis would hit the country with devastating force. Unemployment soared, public anger intensified, trust in institutions began to erode. And soon, even the monarchy itself would no longer be immune. For the first time in decades, the Spanish crown was about to face something it had not experienced since the restoration of democracy: a crisis of legitimacy. By the beginning of the 2010s, Spain was entering one of the most difficult periods in its modern democratic history. The financial crisis had shaken the country deeply. Millions lost their jobs. Families lost their homes. And public trust in institutions began to collapse. Across Spain, frustration was growing, not only toward politicians, but toward the establishment itself. For decades, the monarchy had largely remained above political conflict. King Juan Carlos I was still remembered by many as the monarch who helped safeguard Spanish democracy after the dictatorship. But now, the institution that once symbolized stability was entering a dangerous territory. In 2011, a corruption investigation known as the News case began dominating headlines. At the center of the scandal was Iñaki Urdangarin, husband of Infanta Cristina and brother-in-law of Prince Felipe. Prosecutors accused him of embezzling funds through a non-profit organization that had received millions of euros in public contracts. For many Spaniards, the scandal shattered the carefully protected image of the royal family. And for the first time in modern history, members of the monarchy were being publicly linked to corruption investigations. Inside the royal household, concern was growing. The crown understood something dangerous was happening. The crisis was no longer political, it was becoming personal. As pressure intensified, the royal family began distancing itself from Urdangarin, but the damage had already been done. Then came the moment that would permanently alter the image of King Juan Carlos. In April 2012, while Spain struggled through economic hardship and record unemployment, the king secretly travelled to Botswana on an expensive elephant hunting safari. The trip only became public after he suffered an accident and required emergency treatment. The reaction was immediate. At a time when ordinary Spaniards were facing enormous sacrifices, the monarch appeared disconnected from the reality of his own country. For many, the symbolic distance between the crown and the public had suddenly become impossible to ignore. In an unprecedented moment, King Juan Carlos publicly apologized. But something fundamental had changed. The untouchable monarchy of the transition was no longer untouchable. And as public confidence in Juan Carlos declined, attention increasingly shifted toward the future, toward Prince Felipe.
Well, in the end, Spain was in a very complex moment. We were coming from the 2008 crisis, and evidently people were very, very tired of the political system in general, right? The interpretations were very different from the left or the right. They blamed whoever they thought was responsible, but the reality was very complex. Felipe, I think he found himself on a few occasions between a rock and a hard place, right? Because, well, we have the Infantas. The Infanta was in the nose case in a very important corruption case. Then there was also the issue of Urdangarin. And, well, in the end, the monarchy, and during a moment of crisis for Spanish society, a large part of society felt it did not respond as it should have. I think Felipe projected an image of great calm, of great stability, and he tries a little bit to be that counterpart to the monarchy, which well, was even at times teetering, right, in terms of public opinion. So it was a very, very important role. We cannot understand the final years of the reign of Juan Carlos I, a king who was also very worn down, a king who also came with a certain affinity for the Franco regime, because the law of succession of the year 1947 is where it begins, right? And in the end, Felipe also wants to project that renewed image of the monarchy.
Where the old monarchy now appeared associated with excess, controversy and secrecy, Felipe projected discipline, restraint and stability. The difference between father and son became increasingly impossible to ignore. Many Spaniards began to see the prince not simply as the future king, but as the monarchy's last opportunity to reinvent itself. In 2014, Felipe VI became King of Spain, a new monarch for a new era. In his first speech, he promised a monarchy defined by integrity, transparency, and public service. The message was clear. The crown understood it needed to change. But the real test of Felipe's reign had not yet arrived. By 2017, Spain was entering a constitutional crisis unlike anything seen in decades. For years, the independence movement in Catalonia had been gaining strength. What began as a political demand for greater autonomy had grown into a direct challenge to the constitutional order. Catalonia was no longer just a regional question. It became one of the greatest tests of Spain's democracy since the transition. When the Catalan regional government organized an independence referendum declared illegal by Spanish courts, the situation escalated rapidly. The images shocked the nation. Political chaos, violence in the streets, a country suddenly questioning its own unity. Then, on October the 3rd, King Felipe VI addressed the nation. The speech would become one of the defining moments of his reign. Firm and uncompromising, the king condemned the actions of the Catalan leadership and defended Spain's constitutional order. For many Spaniards, Felipe had acted decisively during a moment of national uncertainty. For others, especially within Catalonia, the speech marked the moment the king ceased to be a neutral figure above politics. The address divided opinion across Spain, but it also revealed something important. Felipe VI was willing to place the survival of the constitutional system above his own popularity. But Felipe's response to Catalonia did not end with one televised address. In the years that followed, the king continued to appear in Catalonia at institutional, cultural, and economic events. His presence itself became part of the message. The crown would not disappear from Catalonia. Even when parts of Catalan society rejected him, Felipe continued to defend the idea of a Spain built on constitutional unity, regional diversity, and shared institutions. During visits linked to the Princess of Girona Foundation, he also spoke of a Catalonia open, plural, and belonging to all its citizens. It was a quieter strategy than the speech of October the 3rd, less dramatic, but politically significant. Yet while the king faced political tensions in public, another crisis was quietly growing inside the monarchy itself. The scandals surrounding former King Juan Carlos had never fully disappeared, but now new investigations into his financial activities were beginning to emerge. Reports involving offshore accounts, undisclosed assets, and alleged commissions dominated headlines, both inside and outside Spain. The monarch, once celebrated as the architect of modern democratic Spain, was now facing one of the greatest reputational collapses in royal history. For Felipe VI, the situation posed an extraordinary challenge, because the crisis was no longer limited to politics. It had become deeply personal. To protect the crown, the king now had to distance himself from his own father. Felipe renounced any personal inheritance linked to undisclosed financial structures associated with Juan Carlos. He also removed the former king's public allowance from the royal budget. Then in 2020, Juan Carlos I left Spain and moved to Abu Dhabi. The departure marked the symbolic end of an era. For decades, Juan Carlos had embodied the success of Spain's democratic transition. Now his legacy had become one of the greatest threats to the institution he once helped restore. Through political division, public scrutiny, and institutional crisis, Felipe VI continued trying to stabilize the monarchy. His style was different from that of his father, less spontaneous, perhaps, but more deliberate. Felipe sought to bring the monarchy closer to citizens and to Spain's social, cultural, and economic life. A crown more present in the country's institutions and more adapted to the demands of a modern society. Under his reign, the monarchy became smaller, more controlled, and more carefully managed. Not a crown built on spectacle, but on continuity. And as Spain slowly entered a new chapter, attention increasingly turned toward the future of the institution itself, toward the next generation. As Felipe VI worked to stabilize the monarchy during one of the most difficult periods in its modern history, another transition was already quietly taking shape. The future of the Spanish crown was no longer represented only by the king himself, but increasingly by his eldest daughter. From an early age, Leonor's public role was carefully introduced to the country. Much like her father before her, she was being prepared for a responsibility shaped by both tradition and uncertainty. Over the years, Felipe VI has taken on a role that extends beyond that of a king alone. He has also become the guide responsible for preparing the next generation of the monarchy. In recent years, that preparation has become increasingly visible. Following the same path once taken by her father, Princess Leonor began military training across the army, navy, and Air Force. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. A future queen being shaped not only through ceremony, but through discipline, institutional duty, and national service. In 2023, upon turning 18, Princess Leonor swore allegiance to the Spanish Constitution before Parliament. The ceremony marked one of the most important milestones in her journey as heir to the throne. For many Spaniards, the moment carried echoes of another generation, a reminder that the monarchy's future was already being carefully prepared. Together, Felipe VI and Queen Letizia have attempted to project a monarchy more connected to contemporary Spain, more transparent and more aware of the challenges facing modern institutions. Rather than projecting the distant image traditionally associated with royalty, Felipe VI has often tried to position the crown closer to Spain's social, cultural, and economic life. A monarchy less centered on ceremony alone, and more connected to the realities of modern Spain. Under his reign, the institution has become smaller, more controlled, and increasingly professionalized. The goal was not to recreate the monarchy of previous decades, but to adapt it to a very different generation. In 2024, Felipe VI marked 10 years on the throne. The anniversary carried symbolic weight. A decade earlier, he had inherited a monarchy damaged by scandal and public distrust. Now the institution appeared more stable, though still navigating a deeply polarized Spain. At the same time, public attention increasingly shifted toward Princess Leonor. Not simply as the heir to the throne, but as the possible future of the monarchy itself. In a country increasingly shaped by political polarization, generational change, and skepticism toward traditional structures, the survival of the crown can no longer depend on history alone. More than a decade after his proclamation, Felipe VI remains a figure who continues to divide opinion. To supporters, he preserves stability during years of uncertainty. To critics, the monarchy remains an institution struggling to justify its place in a rapidly changing society.
I think that in Spanish society, I wouldn't dare say to what extent the monarchy is a debate. I think that today Spain has much more tangible or much more day-to-day concerns. and the monarchy is not usually a primary concern for Spaniards, right? If anything, I see the money it costs the public coffers, which is nearly 8 million, and is what most concerns the pockets of the Spanish people, and above all, where that money goes. But I do believe that King Felipe was a king that the monarchy above all needed. He has offered a renewed image on a diplomatic level up. Ultimately, in many countries around the world, having the prime minister or the president go is sometimes even taken as an offense. In monarchies, a royal representative has to go, right? And that is Felipe. So I do think he has a very important role, although I believe there is still much left to see.
And yet, despite the crisis, scandal, and political tension, the Spanish crown still stands. Perhaps not with unquestioned confidence it once possessed, but with something different: adaptation. Because the story of Felipe VI was never simply about inheriting a throne. It was about inheriting a monarchy at risk of losing its place in modern Spain and trying to ensure it still had a future. Now that future is already beginning to pass to the next generation. The question is no longer whether Felipe VI can change the monarchy. The question is whether he changed it enough.